Before I introduce our presenters, there's a few housekeeping tips. You can ask questions during the presentation by using the question and answer module on the right-hand side of your screen. A session facilitator is monitoring the questions and will pose them at suitable times during the presentation. If we aren't able to answer all questions during the live presentation, we will answer them via email after the session is over. It is important that you include your email address when you ask a question, otherwise we will have no way to send you an answer. The presenter's contact information can be found on your handout. Also in your handout are several discussion questions. We encourage you to think about these questions and discuss them with your colleagues as a way to further engage with the topic of the presentation today. In order to receive your certificate of attendance, you must have signed in after 8:50 a.m. Evaluations for this session will be emailed to you after the session. Please fill them out and return them. We rely on your feedback to continually improve what we do and how we do it. Today's presentation and handouts will be posted for viewing and downloading on the CMC website, fasd-cmc.alberta.ca. As Alberta continues to evolve the FASD 10-year strategic plan, education and training continues to be critical aspects in the plan for all stakeholders, individuals living with FASD, their families, caregivers, networks, researchers, policy and program staff, and so forth. This is our 5th year of offering sessions. We are now broadcasting via both webcasting across Canada and video conferencing technology in the north. As always, these sessions are taped and we will be available on the CMC website or fasd-cmc.alberta.ca. We are pleased with the ongoing interest and attendance in this initiative. We appreciate the work of CASA, Child, Adolescents and Family Mental Health, Teacher TV, and the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research in making this initiative a success. Today's session is titled The Edmonton Mile, Results of a One-Year Pilot Project to Improve School Functioning for Children with FASD. The presentation will review the Math Interactive Learning Experience, MILE, program, which is an intervention developed by Coles, Cable, and Taddeo in 2007, specifically for young children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. MILE targets mathematics and underlying skills important for math in individual tutoring sessions. The authors will review research on MILE published in the USA and also preliminary results from a replication and extension of the MILE program conducted in Edmonton, Alberta. Dr. Jacqueline Pye is a registered psychologist specializing in neuropsychological assessment and is an assistant professor of education psychology at the University of Alberta. She is also a member of the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital Diagnostic Team. Dr. Carmen Rasmussen is an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics and member of the Centre for Neuroscience at the University of Alberta. She is also a research affiliate at the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pye and Dr. Rasmussen.
Thank you. So I will start this morning. I'm Carmen Rasmussen, and I'll start reviewing some of the math difficulties in children with FASD, and then I'll hand it over to Jackie, and then I'll come back. I just wanted to note, it was actually, I just looked, and it was almost exactly a year ago, it was March 28th last year, that we presented on math difficulties in children with FASD, and we talked about this great new study that we were going to be doing, looking at this MILE program, and so it's really nice to be back here exactly 1 year later with some results, and some really good results from the program, so really happy to come back and be able to talk about the results. I just want to acknowledge the co-investigators on this project. Katrina Cully-Martins is a graduate student working with Jackie Pye and myself. Gail Andrew with the Glenrose Hospital FASD diagnostic team, and then Claire Coles and Julie Cable, who are actually the individuals who developed the MILE program, and we've been collaborating with them on this study, and they're from Emory University in Atlanta in the United States. So today I'm just going to do a quick review of math impairments in FASD, and then Jackie will review the MILE program and go into a lot more detail on the program than we did when we talked about it a year ago. And then I will discuss the Edmonton MILE project and some of our results. And then we'll end with some discussion and questions about considering ways to apply what we know to practice or to educational settings. So we do know that math is a specific area of difficulty in individuals with prenatal alcohol exposure and individuals with FASD. Math tends to be one of the weaker areas when you look across all academic and cognitive domains. So, of course, these individuals tend to have difficulty in, reading and other areas as well, but math tends to be the lowest, and so there seems to be a specific difficulty in math. These occur even when we're controlling for IQ, so it's not only related to lower cognitive ability, because the math difficulties usually are lower than predicted based on their IQ. In the longitudinal research, the math in the States, math difficulties associated with prenatal alcohol exposure were noted as young as age 4 and persisted through adulthood, so they don't really go away, and if anything, they might get worse. So we definitely need effective interventions to help ameliorate some of the math difficulties. One study, for example, found that adults with FASD, their math level was at a second grade level, so definitely something that persists over time. Why do kids with FASD or adults with FASD have such difficulties with math? There's a few theories that are put forth and research that I've looked at testing these associations, but one is that it may be related to an overall slower processing speed and slower processing efficiency in children with FASD. Of course, we think it's also obviously related to underlying brain function, potentially maybe related to white matter tracts in the left parietal area. So we have a study that we did with Level et al., where we looked at the white matter tracts coming in and out of an area in the left hemisphere in and around the interparietal sulcus, which is known to be involved in mathematics. And we actually found that the integrity of those white matter tracts in the brains of children with FASD was correlated with their math performance. So there's actually a direct brain behavior relationship here that we have established. And then it may be related to overall difficulties with executive function. So executive functions are those higher order cognitive processes thought to be mediated by the frontal lobe, involve reasoning, planning, working memory, inhibition, a lot of the really complex skills, and of course a lot of those are involved in math. In particular, one component of executive functioning is working memory. So that's really your short-term immediate memory. As if you're asked to remember a phone number and you repeat the phone number and whatnot, it's your short-term immediate memory. So we know that in children without FASD, working memory is highly correlated with math performance. And children with math disabilities also have difficulties on working memory. And then we have set some evidence for some research that we've done that shows that the math difficulties in young children with FASD are highly correlated with their working memory abilities. So working memory is one really key underlying cognitive function that's really important for doing math. And it's something that is focused on in the MILE program that we will talk about. So that just gives you a brief background and update. I know in the last presentation we went into more detail on this, but just to refresh everybody's minds about the math difficulties in FASD and kind of what we're dealing with. And now I'll hand it over to Jackie, and she's going to do more of an extensive review of the MILE program, and then I'll come back and talk about the results.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carmen. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the MILE program as developed by Julie and Claire. And so this is sort of to give you the framework that we worked with to begin with to develop what we did in Edmonton. And when Carmen talks, she'll let you know about the changes that we made. But we want to start with what got us interested, because we were really interested when we read about this. Carmen and I do a lot of reading, and we're really big fans of not reinventing the wheel. And so we'll read something and say, wow, these guys got some awesome results. This is cool. Why can't we try this in Edmonton? And so we do. And we sometimes make some changes to fit our context. But let me tell you a little bit about what got us excited about this. So as Carmen already indicated, this program was developed by Claire Coles as well as Julie Cable at Emory University School of Medicine. And what they did is they started by looking at math, and as Carmen kind of said to you there's some underlying components of the way that our brain works that contribute to why we have problems in math. It's not just that I can't put two numbers together. There are problems that precede that. There are underlying issues that are contributing to what happens in math. And Julie and Claire got that, and they said, it's not just math skills. Math is sort of an underlying marker of the fact that there's some core deficits. So perhaps working memory and some of these pieces that Carmen talked about. And they say these core deficits impact things like motor skills, arousal regulation, visual spatial skills, and learning. And that we can look at teaching methods to address these underlying problems. And so that was sort of their philosophy. Let's look at what underlies the math, and then let's address those issues and see what happens to math. We're not just going to teach math here. And that's a novel approach to an intervention. And that's sort of saying, hey, we want to get at the root cause of what's going on. So what were their goals? They said, well, we want to have a few goals here. So our goals are going to go beyond let's just improve math performance, because these kids are complex and there's more to meets the eye. So they said we want to support and educate and empower caregivers. So caregivers were an important part of their project. And that's important to note because we made some changes with regards to that in our project, and Carmen will talk about that. They wanted to achieve learning readiness. And so they were working with a fairly young group of kids, and they're looking at how to prepare these kids with these underlying core skills to achieve this readiness for learning. They also wanted to improve mathematical achievement. So they said, yeah, we also want math to get better. So they worked with children 3 to 10 years of age, and they wanted kids who were fairly stable, so they've been with a caregiver for a little while, and they were going to continue to be with that caregiver for a while. So they wanted to have kids involved in the program who had a sufficient degree of stability that they would really be able to engage in the program. They wanted evidence of a diagnosis and no other major diagnoses that would interfere. So basically, these are just the research parameters that they set so they could say this is the population that we're working with, and there's nothing else that's really interfering with the ability of the intervention to be successful. They then assign these kids to 2 groups. They put them either in a math intervention group or just sort of a standard psychoeducational group where you just do standard math kind of educational teaching. So we had the MILE group and then the other group. And the reason we do that is if we have 2 groups doing 2 different interventions, we can compare the results between the 2. Because it's not enough for me to say that if I give the MILE program to these kids and their performance improves, how do I know it was the MILE program? How do I know it wasn't just they just developed? That's what happened, or something was happening in the school system that made it work for them, or who knows. But if I compare them to another group of kids who are kind of matched for skills, then I can say, okay, we put these 2 kids in 2 programs, and this is the group that really improved, not this group. And that gives me a certain degree of evidence for the success and the efficacy of that program. And when I get that kind of evidence, then I can say this is the thing to do, this is more important than this. Because part of looking at interventions is to find the evidence that these are the best approaches to use so that we can take that evidence to policymakers and other people to help to implement these strategies. But without that level of evidence, we don't have much of an argument. What they did here is they also provided parental instruction on FASD to the individuals. The math intervention group was focused on math, and the contrast group on standard education. So again, when they were in the MILE group, the parents received fairly focused kinds of information and much more generalized information for those who were just in the psychoeducational group, just sort of general learning stuff. So that's how they separated. So both had a caregiver component, so they were controlling for that piece as well. And then they assessed the kids on behavior and math before and after the 6-week intervention. 6 weeks, that's the length of this intervention. And so they basically said, let's test them on how they're functioning in behavior and math and other pieces before and after, and we want to see if there's a change. And change is what we're looking at. And does the MILE group change more than the contrast group? So I'm going to first talk about the parent education component a little bit, because they sort of, even in the way they reported their results, they looked at what was the impact of the parent education, and then they looked at what was the impact of the actual intervention with the kids. So there was a bit of separation, although when they report the results, they certainly see the program as being quite integrated, but they also pulled out some separate results from the 2 components, the parent caregiver training and the actual intervention delivered to the kids. So the parent education was really about empowering these caregivers who are working with these kids to be partners in working with the children. So it's very important to them that these caregivers come on board as partners and have an active role in the work that's being done with the kids, but they felt that there needed to be some work done with the caregivers to empower them in order to embrace this partnership role. Otherwise, you just say, hey, do this, and they do it, but they never feel the confidence, or they don't feel that the enthusiasm or the interest in doing it. And so they really felt there had to be an empowerment component to motivate and catalyze these caregivers to engage. So what they did with the parents is they worked through some manuals, and they wanted to educate and empower. They wanted to help them to have the basic skills that enables them to help achieve learning readiness for the children in their care. So those were the things that they kind of worked through. Their program is very standardized, is very set, and so they have a lot of manualized aspects, which is really nice when we look at it, even when we make it adaptations, because it creates a nice level of structure. And the great thing about structure in delivering an intervention program is it increases our ability to replicate it in an efficacious way, meaning I can replicate it and know that I'm doing the same thing and see if I'm getting the same results, which really gives power. If I'm doing something totally different, well, then I'm comparing apples and oranges. And so the fact that they did such a fantastic job of standardizing this gives us the ability to replicate it and also then take this out into schools at some point in time potentially and make this something that could become very accessible to people. The parent training component was completed by all caregivers in the intervention as part of being readiness, part of the readiness to learn portion of the program, of the intervention, pardon me. It incorporated recognized behavioral management principles into the context of the neurodevelopmental damage. So we said, this is what you're dealing with the brain, this is what the children in your care might be experiencing, and these are the kinds of principles that you can apply to deal with it. So this is even how you can help manage the behavior of your child while you're supporting them in pursuing some of these training goals. So they're really equipping the caregivers in a broad way. And again, this is back to that empowerment. I want you to understand what's going on with your child, and then we want to talk about strategies that respond to this greater understanding. So once you get it, we need to know what to do with it. So 2 real levels of understanding that they were trying to equip these parents with. So what happened with the parent component, and then specifically what happened with regards to the reports of behavioral concerns. So before the children entered the intervention, they were pre-tested on behavior problems identified in the children, and they looked at both internalizing and externalizing problems. So externalizing problems are things like I'm acting out, I'm impulsive, I'm getting into trouble, I'm behaving antisocial, maybe I'm yelling at people, I'm having a temper tantrum, those kind of acting out behaviors. It's sort of external to the person. Internalizing behaviors, which you see are lower than the externalizing, are things like I'm feeling anxiety, I'm feeling sadness, I'm withdrawing, I'm depressed. So it's not surprising with these kids that the caregivers are reporting a higher level of externalizing problems. These are the problems that are in your face, and they're usually the ones that jump out at you. So even if kids have just as many internalizing, we don't usually see them, because the externalizing are so in your face, you can't get past them to get to the internalizing. So this is not an unusual pattern for us to see with kids with an FASD, and it was consistent here. And then you see that 6 weeks after the intervention, they took a look again at what happened to the behaviors. Both internalizing and externalizing were reduced post-intervention. So we're seeing that the parents are experiencing or reporting that they are experiencing less behavioral concerns with the kids. And then what's really interesting is they also went on to look at these kids 6 months later. So they also said, okay, we looked at them sort of pre-intervention, 6 weeks, we do the intervention, let's look at them again. Let's wait 6 months because, maybe it's just sort of like the fresh experience, or the parents are so pumped up and so empowered that they're seeing everything, through those rose-colored glasses. Maybe after 6 months, the shine will dull a little bit and the problems will, surge. So they took a look at 6 months. Well, look at that. If anything, they dropped a little bit more. So that shows that there's some staying power with some of what's happening, whether that be in the parents' ability to reframe what they're seeing and their understanding, or whether the new strategies they're able to employ are actually addressing the behavioral concerns better, whether we're actually seeing a reduction in the behavior problems. Hard to know which one is creating this, but nonetheless, we know that we have a situation where there is less stress in that home environment as that caregiver is experiencing and perceiving less behavioral problem, which enables them to better connect with that child to meet that child's needs. So some really positive and exciting results. What they concluded around their workshops is that they were well received, and majority of the people who attended said, yeah, these were really useful. That's great to hear when you get people to invest in something and they find it useful. They reported an increased knowledge of what is FAS, how do I advocate for my child, and what are some behavior regulation methods. So understanding what do I do, how do I understand, and what do I do was gained. And both parents and teachers reported improvement in children's behavior afterwards. So there was also some teacher reports that were completed of behavior pre and post. And the teachers were also reporting improvements in behavior. So that's sort of the caregiver component. Running side by side to that caregiver component is also the actual intervention with the children, the work that's being done with the children. And here again, the goal is to improve mathematics achievement, and also to improve the effortful control of behavior. So understanding that if we're looking at those underlying principles, there needs to be a certain degree of self-regulation and behavioral control if I'm even going to engage in the task. So remembering that they're not focusing just on can they do 1 + 1, they're saying, well, what does it take to even get to the point of being able to do 1 + 1? Well, I better be able to sit down. Can I even hold a pencil? Can I put the pencil on the paper and draw something? There's a number of fundamental skills that underlie that. And again, that's what they're looking at when we're talking about this effortful control of behavior. They're looking at the big picture of those underlying skills. So again, we've talked about the caregiver training. The child tutoring is a 6-week program. And again, they've got a curriculum they use. It's one-on-one tutoring sessions. The teacher is also provided with some information in terms of a manual and a discussion regarding the child's neurodevelopmental profile. So teachers are provided with some information about the child and the child's level of functioning ahead of time. And there's discussion regarding sort of a 6-week plan. So one of the things that they would do is when they did their pre-testing involved looking at these fundamental skills as well as the math skills, so that what they would do with the actual intervention itself is they would tailor it to the specific needs of the child. So not every child is getting the exact same intervention. It's all running out of the same sort of curriculum, like they're all picking it out of the same stuff right here. So it's all coming out of the same shared manual, but certain kids with different areas of difficulty are going to focus more on one area than another. So that's that IEP idea, that individual education plan. So we're trying to work within, or Claire and Julie were trying to work within this idea that we're still trying to individualize somewhat, but we need to standardize enough that allows for replication. So we want a manual that's standardized and gives us this is the stuff to go to, but then we want to have a little flexibility in how the manualized information is used and how the program is honed for each child. So there will be a little variation in the exact nature of the intervention delivered to each child so that it meets their needs. Because we know with an FASD that the brains are developing a little bit differently, so the specific needs of 2 different children might be slightly different. So we don't need it to be sort of cut out of the exact same cloth, but we need it close enough that we can still replicate it without too much difficulty. And they did that beautifully. As I said, they taught parents about math development. They encouraged parents to be a part of this process. There were worksheets and things that the kids brought home. So not only did they work with a tutor and get these 6-week sessions, but they also had parents providing support at home. So these are our newly empowered partnered parents who are able to help to implement this intervention from a home setting, or at the very least they're reinforcing it. So they're not doing the curriculum teaching, but when the kids are bringing home the worksheets or doing the follow-up, the caregivers are there to support that. This is a look at, my slide kind of overlaps there in a crazy way. But bottom line, there's a online site that they use that helps to tailor the kids. So again, looking at the manualized, they actually go online, select a category, and identify the needs of the kids. Again, they've set up this beautiful system, which for us, Carmen and I look at it, we go, oh, hey, this is great, when there's a system. Actually, I think it was even our student, Katrina, who got really excited, wasn't it? I'm looking at Carmen because I can't remember, but I think it was she who even looked at it and said, this is fantastic. They've set it up so well. So what are some of the things they do with this intervention? Let me tell you a little bit about some of the strategies they're teaching kids and what they're actually kind of doing. They're looking at a number of different underlying cognitive factors. So some things they're looking at is the general learning ability of the kids. What's the general capacity of the kids to learn? Because it's going to be a little different for different kids. And depending on what that learning ability is, we want to tailor the pace of instruction. So some kids are going to need to work at a very different rate than other kids. So we're going to tailor it. We're going to look at active learning, learning that's engaged and physical. These are kids that have a hard time sitting still. So a lot of the MILE program, you're on the ground, you're on the table, you're over here, you're over there, moving. and that fits for these kids. So we're responding to their learning ability and wherein sit the strengths. Lots of touch, talk, and experiment. So that's part of that active. Let me try this. What happens when this happens? Or what happens? Or let me trial and error this to work my way through it. So these are helping to address some of those general ability, and they can do so, these tutors, because they have that one-on-one time. I mean, these are great learning strategies for any child, but what teacher has that time to do that one-on-one with a child in a classroom? They're just not there. And even if you had a class of 25, can you imagine 25 kids doing active learning? Maybe there's some awesome teachers. I would love to hear, at the end, if there are awesome teachers who have figured out how to do that for an entire class. I can't imagine 25 kindergarten, well, I guess kindergarten kids are always active learning, aren't they? That's the station thing. But they really could work on this and tailor it again to the needs of the kids. They looked at working memory. They said, you know what, we want to see what the capacity of the working memory is. Carmen talked about how fundamental working memory is to math, and they appreciate that. And so they said, we have to look at smaller pieces of information. The bigger the information, the harder these kids to have working with it. So let's just reduce the information. Not rocket science, but it's something that we have to be really intentional about and think about how we do it. How do we shrink it down, and what's the right fit for each kid? A lot of use of rhymes and songs, alternative learning. Rhymes and rhythmic stuff can be great for kids, right? Even the fact that half of us learn the ABCs by singing them, right? These rhymes, half of us, speaking for myself anyway, I don't even think I can say the alphabet without singing it. It just happens that way. And if somebody asks me to say it without singing it, I think I'm not sure I know all the letters. But anyway, that's maybe not anything I needed to share. But the idea is use of rhymes and songs are a really effective strategy for working with kids. And it's very non-threatening, it can be very rhythmic, it can be very active, and it can be very engaged. And it utilizes different aspects of memory. And you work with kids and you look at how much music they hold in their heads, we know that this is something that can really connect for some children. Some children. Always some, right? And that's the wonderful thing about this program is we can say some, and it doesn't restrict the way that we can tailor this. The use of cues, how to cue kids and how to support kids, and the way to use cues. So a cue that says, let me take you a next step along. For the educators out here, you're all used to the idea of scaffolding. That's what we're talking about here, scaffolding. How do I take that kid just a little bit higher? How do I support them through cues to get a little bit further? And the training that goes with MILE helps to develop in the tutors the skills to deliver those cues and to scaffold that learning in a way it's effective. So we're not doing it for them, but we're helping to lift them up. Lots of repetition and practice. Repetition. And again, repetition is crucial. Repetition is really crucial even for the way our brain develops. If we want our brain to change, if we actually want to see these impacts, as Carmen told us, we've clearly seen a brain behavior relationship in math difficulties. So interventions and strategies that allow us to engage in the kind of repetitive activity that allows for strengthening of neural connectivity or neural networks, right? If we can strengthen the roads in there, we're going to be in a better place for helping these kids in the future. And so repetition is crucial for that. And engaged repetition, because if the kids are bored, they're not going to repeat. So we have to get them to repeat, which is why, again, music, songs, man, you could sing a song over and over and over and over again. That's great. That can really help. Time for recall. That's a huge one. A lot of times, and a lot of the kids that we work with, they require more time. So it's like, here's this thing, and then it's like, you hear the crickets, and then out it comes. But we don't get those opportunities typically in learning. And when we give those kids the time for the recall that they require, we're allowing them to really consolidate and integrate that understanding. So in the future, they may speed up, they may not, but they may because they've had that ability to begin consolidating that understanding. So these are big pieces that they're working in. Visual spatial skills, lots of manipulatives. Let's get into really concrete learning. Abstract can be really tough for a lot of our kids. And so the more we can be concrete and tactile involved, I can see it, and not have to think about it in my head, this is better. This helps. Guiding visual attention. How do we direct visual attention? Having that engaged tutor. Adding structure to paper. It's one of the best strategies I find, well, with any kids who have any kind of fine motor difficulties, and a lot of our kids with an FASD have serious fine motor difficulties. And have you ever tried doing math with fine motor difficulties? I mean, just try lining those numbers up. No wonder I couldn't add anything, because your numbers are all skewed and they all end up in different places. So as you see on the slides, even things like graph paper, fantastic. Teaching kids how to use graph paper for math. Particularly, you saw it was 3 to 10 years old. So some of those kids are a little older. They're going to get into some of this sort of math. So what do? You teach them how to use graph paper. You write the question in red, and then you do the answer in blue or in pencil or whatever, and you set it up on paper, and it helps to structure, and it creates a structure that they're unable to create on their own. Small little bit, but it can make a radical difference for some of these kids and their ability to see those numbers, and it's easy to do. And easy for them to take on with them into classrooms, right? Other things is the vertical number line. Vertical number line, I talk about that all the time because it's so impactful for the kids, and it's just something that we don't think about. But when we have a number line that goes side to side, it's really abstract. The idea of going from right to left in order to get bigger is actually an abstract idea. Right, so we go 1, 2, 3, 4, and we know because it's kind of like reading and things like that. So we kind of have this abstract understanding gets bigger. These guys have trouble with abstract. But when something goes from down to up, well, up is bigger than down, right? Everything that goes up gets bigger. So shifting your number line to a vertical as opposed to a horizontal, right there, we've all of a sudden shifted to a more concrete strategy. And they don't have to try to negotiate the abstract and the counting at the same time. No, I'm going up, therefore I'm getting bigger. That's concrete as opposed to side. Kind of simple stuff, and yet if we don't realize it and we don't think about it, we don't recognize that. And those are some of the simple little things that are really easily transported into a classroom setting as well when the kids take this learning back. They also did a lot of work on visual motor, graphomotor skills, and helping the kids with those basics. So not only were they saying, let's give them graph paper and let's help with structure, but let's also help with some of the basic graphics. And they utilized programs like Handwriting Without Tears and those kinds of things to help the kids improve their fine motor skills. Because having those fine motor skills to complete some of these tasks is going to help them significantly. If you can't read your own writing when you're doing a math test or engaged in a math test, there's no way there's no way you're going to get it correct. Or if you get it correct, nobody knows you did. But you're not even going to be able to read your own work, right? And so how are you going to do math? And so being able to at least, doesn't even need to be neat and perfect, but you need to be legible. And so that you'll see there's a pre-test and a post-test there, and demonstrating the improvement that can be seen. And these kids with repetition and practice can improve. This is a skill that can improve. And a lot of times we say, oh, we've got computers, we have alternatives, and yeah, those are great. But when it comes to numbers and math, there's so many places in the world still that we're required to replicate numbers. I mean, so many places that having kids have the basic ability to reproduce a number with some kind of clarity remains a necessary and important skill. We're just not always going to have the alternative for them right now. And particularly kids who are not in a position to afford some of the technology that might help them to compensate for this kind of difficulty. And so it's worthwhile, investing in this, and they certainly have seen some change, and that's some success for these kids. They also work a lot with metacognition. So they said we want to build skills, but we also want to go a level higher with the kids and work with metacognitive abilities and say, not only do we want to help improve the basic skills, but we want to start giving these kids the strategies to improve them skills themselves. So I want them to leave where they have questions to ask or things that they can do that allow them to keep evolving and developing. So, great answer. How did you do that? Oh, well, getting the kids to be reflective. How did I actually get from here to here? And doing that over and over again, training, that's a very high metacognitive, but it forces them to think, well, how did I get from here to here? How did I get from here to here? And do that over and over again. It'll put me in a better position to reproduce it later when I start to understand how I did it this time. Because otherwise it's really hard to do it again if I don't know how I got there. What strategy did you use? Well, I don't know what I used. Well, did you do this? Oh, I did. So is that a strategy? Yeah. Oh, well, that's a great strategy, I guess. Do you think you could do it again? Sure. until we get to the point where you can recognize and identify strategy. I used graph paper and it helped. Great. If I can get to the point where I know that I got to go get graph paper before I do a math, that's a metacognitive ability where the child can then initiate their need for graph paper, get it, and use it, as opposed to always having somebody have to remind them, and then when they don't use it, everything goes south. So it's about developing a little bit of capacity in the kids to help implement these strategies. What do you think you need to do here? Engaging them in this and having them think about what they're doing. This is part of what they call a FAR approach to metacognitive strategy, where they are encouraging kids to break down their engagement in tasks from focusing and planning, focus on what you need to do and plan how you're going to do it. Act on it, do it, then reflect. How did that work? How did that work for me? And this, again, is one of those areas that's repeated and repeated. So we're doing all these tasks, we're playing with manipulatives, we're thinking about visual spatial relationships, I'm practicing my printing, whatever, and amongst all of these things, I'm saying I need to focus and plan. So I have these numbers and I got to figure out how to put them together. Focus and plan. How am I going to add these two numbers? Focus and plan. All right, to do it, it's sometimes hard for me to write numbers down well. I better get graph paper. Okay, I'm going to get graph paper. Then I act, I do it. Then I reflect. How did I do? I got it right. Oh, this graph paper really helped. I used graph paper as a strategy and it worked, so I'm going to use it again next time. That would be an example of how they take the kids through this and over and over and over again, using the word FAR to help remind them of what they're doing and implementing it with them in all their activities. So what did they find? They found that after controlling for age of child, there was a significant effect for the treatment, both when they looked at the kids after 6 weeks, so immediately after the treatment, you see in that first bar, and then after 6 months, that was maintained. Really strong treatment result there. And so the group that got the miles, so we did, as I explained to you at the beginning, they had a contrast group and then they had their mile group. So both these groups received an intervention. That dark blue bar is the group that got mile, and the pale blue bar is the group that got the regular psychoeducational. We saw improvement for both groups. How much of that was just improvement that would have occurred over time? We don't know. But what's really important is the difference between that pale blue bar and that dark blue bar, and that's significant. The kids who are in the MILE program doing these specific types of activities that were targeted to meet these underlying needs underneath their math skills, employing metacognitive strategies with caregivers at home who were prepared to help follow through on some of these activities, did significantly better, both immediately after they were provided with the intervention and 6 months later, it held. We're not seeing these things all fall off. These kids are still performing that much stronger after 6 months. That's really exciting. That tells us that this is sticking, that there's some staying power with this. And these are the kinds of things that got us excited. Overall, what do they conclude? Children can improve in learning readiness, behavior, and math, because we already discussed the behavior improvements, so parents were also reporting behavior improvements. So to remember that, we not only saw that math improve, but behavior also was reported to have improved. We saw parent education reported improvements. We saw that when we scaffolded according to children's needs, that we saw greater success, and they concluded that this is very important. They really liked the integration of strategies between caregiver and family. That was something that they concluded was an important piece. They found that supporting growth in areas associated, so those underlying areas, so how do we support that, was a really strong part of their program. So instructional techniques that are geared towards the foundational elements, not just math, were important. And the use of metacognitive strategies to equip these children to employ those strategies as they go forward, so that they're not completely dependent on that tutor to be there to cue and remind them all the time. So we're trying to equip them not just with the strategies, but with the ability to implement and use those strategies as well. And that's kind of what Claire and Julie did with the MILE program that got us very excited. And now Carmen is going to let you know what we did here in Edmonton, what we changed and what we found, and all of these pieces.
Okay, thank you. So really what happened, it was actually about 2 years ago at the last International FASD conference in Vancouver that I got a chance to sit down with Claire Coles and talk about her program. I had been interested in doing the program for a few years. I did my PhD thesis focusing on math and kids with FASD. And so we sat down and I said, I would really like to take your program and implement it here in Alberta, and make some changes and see if we can find similar results here. So we did that. We applied for a grant with the Alberta Centre for Child, Family and Community Research. So we received a grant from them to do a replication and extension of the MAL program. So it wasn't just a simple replication of what they did, because we made quite a few changes that I'll go over. And so the grant was in collaboration with Claire and Julie, who are just ecstatic to have this implemented in Canada. This is really the first implementation of it in Canada. It is being implemented at a couple of other sites and cities in the US, but this is the first initiative in Canada. So they were just very excited about it. And so we're doing this in collaboration with the Glen Rose Hospital, where my lab is, and also local school boards, because we're working directly with the school system. Their study was absolutely phenomenal, a great study, found great results, but there still were some remaining questions to be answered, given what they had found. The first one was whether or not MILE can be successfully conducted in a school or home setting. So I don't know if Jackie mentioned this, but the tutoring sessions in the Coles study were actually conducted in the laboratory. So the kids came into the lab and did the sessions in the lab. And so we wanted to do it in an ecologically valid setting where children are actually learning. So we typically did it in the school system. So we would go to the school, take the child out of class, and do the tutoring and the learning right there. Sometimes we did it in the home if parents preferred that, if it was easier for the parents. There were a few participants that we ran over the summer, so they weren't in school, and so we went to their home. But we did it in a setting that wasn't that the children were familiar with, whereas the laboratory setting they're not. We did the pre and post testing typically in the lab, but the actual intervention was done there. So that's one thing we wanted to look at. Also, because especially for our population here, we felt it was a lot less burden on the families to have to bring their children into the lab for all of these weekly sessions and pay for parking and drive, and a lot of these parents, have so many things going on or are so busy. So this way, it was a lot easier on the parents. We could just do it in the lab or in their home. The second question actually is we wanted to know, is the MILE program effective without the significant parental involvement? Now, don't get me wrong, I think the parental component and parent training is so important. However, in the previous study, we actually don't really know what made the difference. Was it the one-on-one tutoring with the children, or was it the fact that the parents received all of this extra behavioral support and instruction on math? We actually don't know what made the difference. And you really do need to tease them apart to actually to be able to determine what makes the difference. And the fact of the matter is, with some children with FASD, they may not have a consistent caregiver, and so we need to know, can we make a difference in these kids' lives without having to rely on a caregiver who, they could be in a placement for 6 months and then be in another placement later on. And many of them have very stable, very involved caregivers, which is absolutely amazing, but we wanted to know, can we make a difference just with the one-on-one tutoring? And then we also wanted to look at whether or not the MILE program improves other cognitive areas beyond math, because remember, the MILE program is really focusing on those underlying cognitive skills: working memory, visual spatial processing, executive functioning. And in the first study by Coles et al., they basically looked at their effects on math. But if you're focusing on those underlying core areas, we should see improvements in those areas as well. So we wanted to see, does it improve things like working memory, visual spatial abilities, and executive functioning? So some key changes that we made to the project. Another big thing is recall that in the first study, they had a control group who had no intervention but just received standard psychoeducational supports, and I believe they received an individual education plan. Now it's nice to have a group that doesn't receive the intervention. So as Jackie mentioned, you can compare change that would occur just with development to change that should occur with the intervention. But it's also difficult to say, were kids in the intervention group in that study doing better because they were just getting one-on-one time with a person that took them out of class, or that they came into the lab and spent time with them? Was it just the spending one-on-one time with another person, actively engaging and talking and whatnot, that made a difference, or was it the actual tutoring? And the other thing is, we didn't want to recruit children and just assign them to an absolute no intervention control group and a math group, just because we really wanted to offer something to all kids. And I mean, it would just be kind of the luck of the draw if you got chosen for the math group or the math group instead of the control group. So we really wanted to be able to offer something to the control children. So what we did is we tried to think of what type of intervention could we do with the control group that they still need and that could still have a positive effect, but has absolutely nothing to do with math, so there's no cross interference. So we decided on social skills. So we actually chose a social skills intervention that we did with our control group. So they got the exact same amount of one-on-one time with a researcher, with a research assistant, but focusing on completely different things, focusing on their social skills rather than focusing on math. And social skills is a key impairment for these individuals, so it is something that is needed. So we felt that we were able to make some improvements, or hopefully in both groups, with kind of two different sets of research questions. Today I'm going to focus on the math because that's what this presentation is focused on, but hopefully later we can come back and focus on some of the social skills results as well, because I think those will be really interesting. We included different pre and post measures. So we tested a wider variety of math skills than Coles et al. Did in their first study. And then again, as I mentioned, we tested a lot of other cognitive areas: working memory, visual spatial, executive functioning. We conducted the intervention in the school or home, no parental component. And our sample was aged 4 to 10, so a little bit older, and different demographics, obviously, than their sample of participants from Atlanta, Georgia. So the questions that we're looking at is whether or not children with FASD or PAE in the MAL program improve in their mathematics as compared to those in a social skills intervention. But do they also improve in other areas like working memory and visual spatial abilities? And then we wanted to know whether or not these improvements are maintained 6 months after the intervention, just as they did. So this just kind of highlights some of the differences between the studies. So in the Cable et al., that's the Coles study, they had 6 one-hour sessions over 6 weeks. We did 10 half-an-hour sessions over 6 to 8 weeks. So they typically got 2 sessions per week. And that, in part, was because we weren't doing the parental component. So in the Cable study, they were doing the parental component so the parents could be kind of working on these skills throughout the week. Here, we were just doing the tutoring. So we wanted to have more sessions with the child so they weren't forgetting what we were doing and whatnot. And it was, keeping things active in their mind. Again, theirs was in the lab, ours was in the school. Theirs had parental component, ours didn't. Theirs had a sham intervention, which really meant that they had a group that didn't get an intervention. They just had standard psychoeducational services, and then we had a social skills intervention for a comparison group. They only looked at math and behavior. We also looked at math and behavior, but we also looked at social skills, obviously, because we want to see if the social skills intervention is working as well. Behavior, working memory, visual spatial, and executive functioning. Their sample was American children aged 3 to 10 who had a diagnosis of FASD, and they were all clinically referred. Our sample is Canadian, aged 4 to 10. They were clinically and community referred, so we recruited a lot of children through the Glen Rose Hospital, but we also recruited directly through the school system, so children that may have been coded with FASD in the school system and whatnot. So we went that route as well. We included children with FASD and children with PAE. So PAE is just referring to children with prenatal alcohol exposure, but who do not have a formal diagnosis of an FASD, or maybe do not have one at this time. And the reason is because this study is really working with the younger children, aged 4 to 10. Many of the children, particularly in the younger ages, may not have been assessed for FASD yet, but they do have confirmed alcohol exposure and are still considered at risk and potentially having some learning difficulties already. And just because they are not diagnosed yet, we didn't really want to leave them out. And really, because under age 6, most of our children, a lot of them aren't diagnosed. A lot of kids aren't diagnosed with FASD until the school age years, where we have the tools that we can really reliably diagnose them, where we can measure things like executive functioning and whatnot reliably in these children. So we wanted to kind of open up our criteria to FASD and alcohol exposed as well. So far we've tested 17 participants, 11 in the math group and 6 in the social skills group. We really didn't realize from the outset with our grant how expensive intervention research is and how time consuming and costly it is. And so we are now applying for further funds to continue our study, because with the funds that we had, we've been able to run the 2 interventions with 17 children, and it just takes so much work. I mean, it's absolutely great. It's so important. It just takes a lot of time in terms of even just the travel time for the research assistants to travel to and from the schools and the homes. And then, of course, you have children that are maybe sick from school that day, and then you have to come back another day, or didn't work that day because they didn't want to miss gym that day, or whatever. So it's so important, but it takes a lot of time and money, and it just, that's the way it is. And so I'm pretty happy, though, within a year from when we presented last time, where we hadn't collected any data, that we've run 17 children through the interventions, because they were 6 to 8 weeks, so it takes considerable time. So our average age is about 7.5 in both groups, around 4 to 10. The math and social skills group don't differ on that. Around half to a third have a diagnosis of FASD, and then the other half are PAE with no diagnosis yet. The average IQ, we have 87 in our math group and 100 in our social skills group, just because we kind of have one outlier there that had a pretty high IQ of 122. Once we test more participants, IQ probably should even out, just because we only have 6 in the social skills group right now. And about half are male in both groups. So those are our demographics. So we have fully completed the interventions on 17 children, the pre and post testing. Right now, literally, I think yesterday that we were just doing one, and next week we are actively doing the 6-month follow-up. I won't be talking about any follow-up data yet, because we're just doing it right now. We're completing it right now, but we have completed 17 children. So we have 3 interventionists that were directly trained on the MILE program. We actually flew them to Atlanta, and that ate up a big chunk of our grant as well, to go and have the direct training by the experts. We didn't want them just to kind of learn the manuals online. They went there for like 3 or 4 days of intense training, which was really important, and got to meet the team and really learn the basics of the MILE program. And it also was important because then they could practice it, and the individuals that created it could observe them and whatnot. So that happened last January 2011, that they went for the training. And so we have one graduate student, Katrina Cully-Martins, who part of this project is her master's thesis, and then Lauren Ba and Michael Ann LaFrance, who have been doing the interventions and the pre and post testing. So participants were assigned to the MILE or the social skills group. It wasn't really random assignment. It was kind of pseudo-random in that we tried to match the groups on characteristics as closely as possible. Things like IQ, still having a little bit of difficulty with the matching because we, slightly different IQs. We tested them on their pre-math skills, actually. So we didn't end up just by chance having all of the children with a lot of the really significant math difficulties or with lower math scores in the math group, because maybe they would be more likely to see more change just because they're lower to begin with. So we tried to match on overall math ability from the outset, and gender and all of, a few other things as well, and also whether or not they had a diagnosis or not. So as we collect more participants, we'll have further matching on these. So they received 10 sessions, both groups, either 10 focused on the math program or 10 focused on a social skills program. And then the social skills program is the social skills improvement system. I didn't actually list it there. So that's the actual program that we're doing, and we just ordered it online. It's an online established validated social skills intervention program that we're doing with them. We didn't want to come up with our own program. I mean, we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel here, and the focus was on kind of the math here. So they received 30-minute sessions twice a week for 6 to 8 weeks, and it was either done in school during school hours or at home in the daytime. Okay, right into some results here. So this here shows the difference. So the key math is one of the big math tests that we did. I'm not going to talk about all of the math tests, but and we found from pre to post tests, so before and after the 6 to 8 week intervention, you can see the math group is in purple and the social skills group is in blue. And this is the difference in the total raw score on this test, and we see huge improvements in the math group. They improved by about 14 points, and the social skills group improved by less than 2 points. So this is a significant difference, and it's a large difference. So the social skills group also kind of shows maybe what you would expect, because we're testing them on this math test within, before and after an 8-week intervention. So that kind of shows that's probably the change that you would expect just from being tested on the same test twice, or just based on how much they would be developing over 8 weeks anyways, because kids are still learning without the intervention. But as you can see, we see a much larger increase in the math group. And when we actually looked at the standard scores, most of the children, on average, the kids in the FASD group improved by half a standard deviation or more in their standard math score, which is actually a very big improvement, to actually improve by half a standard deviation or more. But none of the kids in the social skills group have done that. So we're actually seeing qualitative jumps in the actual levels of their math achievement. And both groups were below average in math to begin with. Now, of course, the math group isn't above average, or, we're still seeing, of course, they still have some difficulties, but we're seeing significant improvements. Now, when we look at some of the specific subtests of the key math, so I don't know if everybody can see all the words there, but across the board, we see more improvements in the math group than the social skills group, but it was mainly in the areas that were targeted by a mile. So the first one is basic operations, basic math operations, and that's where we see huge improvements in the math group and very little in the social skills group. And then also in geometry as well. The social skills group actually got a little bit worse. Actually, their score went down a bit, which can happen with using different versions of a test and whatnot. But we see across the board more improvements in the math group. And as we test more participants, I think a lot of these differences will be bigger and become more significant. Right now, these are the only two that were statistically significant. However, it's because we have, only 17 children, that as we get up to our goal of having 20 children in each group, which is what we're attaining for, a lot of these will be significant. But again, really seeing positive trends and increases in their math skills. We're not going to talk about the other areas that we are looking at, the visual, spatial, executive functioning, and working memory, simply because we haven't analyzed the data yet. Like, the data is just coming in. We just finished some of the interventions in the fall, so it's been quite the crunch to kind of get through it. So we've analyzed the math data so far, which is obviously the most important, but now we have to go and analyze the other cognitive areas. And then we want to know, for our social skills group, are they improving on social skills, which will be nice to know. We do want to get a little bit more than 6 children in the social skills group to actually look at those changes, because right now it's only with 6 children. Although a lot of intervention research is with pretty small sample sizes, so far we've got some pretty positive results. But we want to wait until we have 20 in each group to actually publish the results. Did you have a question?
I just have a quick question that's come in. I'm wondering if you can repeat the name of the social skills intervention that you used?
So it's the Social Skills Improvement System, the SSIS, and you can just Google that and it'll come right up. You can purchase it through, I think, like the Psychological Corporation or different.
I don't even think it's not restricted. Just it's through the Psych Association, but not a restricted purchase.
Social Skills Improvement System, SSIS. So yes, we will. We are looking at that data as well. Our grant just ended in January, so this is really, really hot off the press data that we're just looking at. We presented some of this at the international conference in Vancouver 2 weeks ago, and so as we collect more data, we'll have more results and more power in our analyses as well. But based on what we've shown so far with our preliminary results with 17 children, we are seeing huge and significant improvements in math. So this shows that math difficulties can be improved in these children in an intervention that is individualized with one-on-one tutoring, but also one that has no parental component. So remember, we removed that component from this just to test whether or not the tutoring made a difference, and the one-on-one tutoring makes a huge difference. It's a very short-term improvement. I mean, these children were improving by like 14 scores, by some children by up to a standard deviation in their standard scores in a 6-week intervention. So that's really, really promising that, in very short term, we can make clinically significant gains, and also an intervention that's conducted in the school or home. We still have a lot of further questions, and we're still collecting data right now. We've started a wait list actually we have a number of people that are on a wait list to participate because we need more funds, basically. Because intervention research is so expensive, our grant ran out, and we still want to collect more data. So we have another grant under review that we'll find out right away if it is successful, and if that one's not, then we will apply back to other agencies. So we're not stopping, we're still going, but basically we've had to stop bringing participants in because we have to make sure that we can actually pay our staff to do it. So, but our next question is to look at whether or not these are maintained, the improvements are maintained at the 6-month follow-up, which we can look at with our current data on 17 children. And we'll just be looking at it now because I think we'll have all of the 6-month follow-up data collected by the summer, and then that will be the end of that. This is really important because, as you saw in the previous study, they actually saw some more improvements beyond the intervention, and that may be because of the significant parental involvement and the significant parental component, that the parents are able to keep working on these skills after the intervention. So it'll be really interesting to see, when we don't have the big parental component, do we still see the improvements later on, or is it just short term? And that has big implications for how the intervention is implemented. Something that we hope to do is further translation into the school system as well, something that we've put in our further grant, in that we can do some training of teachers and whatnot to use these strategies in their classroom as well. So that's something that we have plans for and we really hope to be able to do. Again, another question is, do these transfer to other domains and other abilities, which, another 6 months we'll have that data analyzed and ran through. And then what about that whole social skills intervention? Is that making a difference? I hope so. I really hope so. I really hope that we see improvements in social skills and behavior in those children. And as we get more than 6 in that group, we'll be able to comment on those results as well. But we're really excited so far about the results that we have. We're seeing definitely some positive improvements in math. And I really hope that they are maintained. So I think we'll open it up here to questions and kind of further discussion. We did include some discussion questions that I think are included in people's handouts. They're not here, but they're there somewhere. So, and Jackie will come up here because I'll let her answer all the questions. No.
Yeah, no, I'm just getting directed.
Yeah.
You see the directions
Yeah.
back there? I'm compliant.
So I don't have any questions coming in online yet, but usually once I prompt people with this message, they come through. But if anyone in the room has any questions?
Maybe we just answered everything.
I guess I know you said you weren't going to talk a lot about the social skills intervention this time, but I'm wondering if you can just give a couple examples for me of what they would do with the kids.
Do you want to, Jackie? I know you did the training. A lot of it is taking them through social scenarios and role playing.
Yeah.
And actually, the social skills improvement system was actually designed originally to be done in group settings, and we're doing it individual because we didn't want to have a confounding variable between the two groups. We wanted to keep it individual. But a lot of it is going over different social situations.
Role play,
how they would act and react in a social situation, understanding how another person is feeling and behavior, and learning appropriate behavior. So, basically through role playing.
Yeah.
And with the researcher kind of going through these scenarios, yeah.
Yeah, generating alternative solutions, things like that. What would you do if, when, that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. And I mean, the children find both engaging and fun. So it's, I mean, I think that in both we are.
It's very play. I think both are very play focused. They're both in the even the scenarios are very much generated around having fun and engaging with that person as opposed to high stress. So we do, our RAs and the students work very hard to be engaging and make them non-threatening and more about playing games and having fun than anything else.
And both are focused on younger children. So another important question that I guess I have, and I don't know, I mean, is whether or not we can implement some of the strategies from the MILE program with older children with FASD, because we know that the math difficulties don't go away, and if we have kids now that are already 12 and they want to be on some sort of intervention and participate in something, you know, I would like to work more with Claire and Julie on how, I mean, of course, not everything would translate, but how we could look at implementing some of these strategies with older children when you're getting into some of the more complex math as well. So.
Even at a junior high level. I mean, and even the fact is there's a number of kids that may get to a junior high level and still be struggling, as Carmen indicated. I mean, we're looking at sometimes as, you know, very limited math capabilities even in adults. And so even if we can work with folks at a junior high and a senior high level to help improve some of the basic math that might support just daily living skills as well. I mean, we're not, as Carmen said, we're not looking at putting math up at an average level where these kids are functioning equivalent to their peers. What we're doing is we're trying to, I mean, if we can get
Yes.
awesome, but really what we're trying to do is just lift them up a little bit so that they're in a better position to acquire the basic math skills that are really important to daily living and function as well. So,
I mean, everything from telling time to managing money, and I mean, it really, really relates to a lot of the adaptive functioning difficulties that we see in adults. So,
budgeting, you know, paying bills, you know, grocery shopping, like all of these kinds of things.
Lists, things.
And so these are things that even at a junior, senior high level, we see having some applicability if we can transfer some of this to that age level.
So I just brought that up, even though it wasn't a question, but I really do want to look beyond the 5 to 10 because I think it's really important.
We have a real thing for the adolescent age, I think.
Yeah.
Like we're both pretty excited about trying to find ways to work with adolescents, even though we know that early intervention is very important. We also recognize that there are a large number of kids that get to the adolescent ages that for whatever reason either haven't had an opportunity or, you know, are just still requiring a little bit more support. So, while we want to focus certain energy on that early group, we really want to make sure that we're also looking at what we can do for those adolescent age groups because they've been somewhat neglected in the research and because they're really kind of hard to work with, frankly, because we think you have attendance problems with the elementary school kids, man, 11, we have a lot of problems. Once we get to the junior high, senior high, we certainly have to be fairly flexible in the way that we deliver our intervention approaches. But those are some of our future goals. So.
Thanks. I have some questions coming in, just like I predicted. One question from Michelle is there a reason for one-on-one tutoring as opposed to small groups? And I was kind of thinking about how you were talking about training teachers, too, and how some of those things would be so easy to implement in a classroom, like the graph paper or the up and down number line. But some things would be more useful one-on-one.
Like, I don't think it needs to specifically be one-on-one, and that's why in our new grant we've put in a third phase where we'll look at implementing it into the classroom and teaching teachers, because the fact of the matter is not everybody will be able to get one-on-one tutoring and participate in an intervention, and we're not going to be able to do one-on-one tutoring with everybody that needs it. It's so expensive. So we have to look at what's feasible, even parent training and teacher training, which I think is really the next step for further knowledge translation and transfer.
And really one of the things that we do when we do intervention research is it's kind of like baby steps that we have to take. And so part of those baby steps are, even as we moved it here, we said we need to separate out these two types of interventions so we know what's actually working. So we know that if we can only do this, does it still have an effect? Then we have to say, okay, does it work with individuals first? Let's find out what happens. Then we're going to move it into groups and say, now does it work with groups? So it's kind of like you have to do this stepwise process where we gradually shift things to see, does it still work? So that we understand what the core components are. And so if we can say, yeah, it totally works this part with one-on-one, now what happens when we move it into a group? And what do we need to do? Because feasibility is crucial, Carmen's right, but we have to start with this efficacy piece, which is that, is there evidence that this is actually accomplishing what we're trying to, and can we say, yes, this is having a desired effect? Then we can start thinking about feasibility, and then what we're doing is we're looking at effectiveness. So once we move interventions into school settings and we're starting to train people, we're now looking at effectiveness, where we're saying we need to try to marry feasibility and efficacy, put them together and say, is it still effective? And that will be where we hopefully then take it next. And that's sort of how we try to do a lot of our work.
Thank you. Deb from Prince Albert is wondering, if these strategies might be effective for children living with other limitations, such as ADHD, defiant behavior, developmental delay. So are they transferable?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think anytime you're dealing with a population that has some of these same core areas of difficulty, I don't see why not. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, it would be something that to say that with any value, I'd have to have the evidence, and it'd be
But that's something
that
we are hoping to do, actually, that to
That
look at it in other
cross-clinical?
groups as well. That, but again,
Yeah, well, and we're doing that with a
depends
few
on
things
when-
right now.
yeah.
we
So-
we have a long to-do list, but definitely the cross-population stuff is really, really important. And part of it, this comes back to the feasibility piece too, because if we can demonstrate the usefulness and the evidence to support this intervention across populations, it becomes even more feasible in a school system, because then we can say this is good for everyone, even though it's
Yeah.
particularly good for this population. So,
yeah,
yeah. So I would guess so, but, you know, we don't have the evidence yet.
Yeah.
But my hypothesis would be yes.
yeah.
And if teachers can bring these skills into their classrooms, it certainly won't hurt anybody.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. And if we do the teacher training, we're probably not going to have one classroom with all children with FASD, right? So there's going to be a group of children and, you know, different learning, different needs and whatnot. I mean, I think I would benefit from some of those strategies as well. And I think anybody, you know, so, right? Yeah.
And we're all getting graph paper
Focus.
now. I got the
Yes.
graph paper.
Yeah, so.
I have a parent who's commented, thank you, first of all, for your great presentation. She says, I find that with my son, we can work on skills and without reminders, he can't remember. We have started to work with his iPhone, and he can figure out life skills and math, but he can't really do much on a sheet. He's 18. Any suggestions would help, she says. Most of his issues seem to be with embarrassment.
Oh, yeah. The iPhone is great. If you have the ability to, you know, have one of those. In fact, I have a lot of older adolescents who, where they have the support, where they're able to get something like an iPhone, and you can actually get, you know, those belt clip things, like that actually goes on your belt, especially for the guys. It's not so helpful for the girls. Girls can put something on purse perhaps, but it's like a little holder, so they can always put their phone, because it helps with the losing it a little bit. Not that they don't still lose it, but and then programming in reminders and letting them do the math on it, and having a calculator being really accessible for them on there is certainly an awesome strategy. I love to hear that that's happening. And I've seen a number of kids that find that really effective, and having your phone beep is often less embarrassing than other things, right? Then you're just popular. Nobody knows what it's beeping for. It might be beeping to say, go get on the bus now, but, you know, nobody knows that. I'm just so popular. I'm going to go get on the bus now.
Yeah, no,
I mean, I think it's a great strategy. And I think those are systems of support where we try to, you know, work with these kids, especially at 18. It's like working together. Did that work for you? How did that work? So even these ideas, these metacognitive, it's like, okay, let's focus on it and come up with a plan. What's the issue here? What do we need to deal with? Okay, let's try it. Let's try our plan, and then let's reflect. How did it work? Okay, and because we don't have right now a whole lot of really great answers. And so what we've learned, I think, to some degree, is that it's a bit of that process of working with these folks, working with everyone to generate those kind of solutions. So I love when I hear creative or you know, adaptive responses like that. Like, that's awesome.
I'm trying to remember from last year, we had you do a series of presentations on math, language skills, and memory skills. And I'm wondering if you know of anything similar to MILE for language or memory, and whether you think that might be kind of coming up in Edmonton.
well,
Well, there might be a few things coming up in Edmonton.
yeah. So we're finishing a grant that's due today.
Yeah, I have a grant due today where we're trying to get some stuff for
But we're hoping
supporting it.
to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are continuing to also work on things that we've talked about in previous sessions, where we've talked about some of the computer programming that we, or the computer gaming that we do, in order to help with certain aspects of working memory and inhibitory control. That study is continuing to progress right now. And actually that study is one of the ones that's a little bit further ahead than this, because we started with the one-on-one, finding the efficacy, does this approach work? And we're like, yeah, this approach seems to work, we're getting success with it. So what we're doing with it right now is we've set up an online training module where educational assistants are being trained, and now within those schools, these fantastic partnering schools have freed up their EAs to be a part of this, to try it out, and they're going through the training and then they're implementing the intervention. And that's the step that we're in now, and the next step that's going to come next year is training EAs to try to deliver it with small groups. And so that's all in the works. So that's an example of sort of some working memory and inhibitory stuff that we're actually doing right now. But there are a few other things that we're currently trying to get some funding
Hoping to
for
do, yeah.
that will also be addressing working memory and some of these sort of functional capacities of daily living.
Great, thanks. I think that is all the questions, unless there's any more.
Okay.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting
Thank
presentation.
you. All right.
So thank you very much for that presentation. That was fascinating. I hope you have good luck in getting the grants that you're applying for. Please note, evaluations will be emailed to participants within the next 2 business days, so please be sure to sign the attendance sheet. Your feedback on this session is very important to us. This is the final presentation in this year's FASD Learning Series. Keep an eye out for next year's season's posters. Which will be distributed in the late summer. Our next session will be in September of 2013. Have a wonderful summer, if it ever gets here, and keep in touch.